The child of Maple Park. Las Vegas was a city of contrasts. Bright lights and luxury on one side, forgotten souls and silent suffering on the other. During the day, Maple Park was filled with families, joggers, and workers on lunch breaks. But as night fell and temperatures dropped to record lows, the park became a different world. A world where shadows moved, where those with nowhere else to go sought refuge. And somewhere within those shadows, a little girl barely 3 years old made a bench her home. Officer Daniel Carter had spent years patrolling the streets of Las Vegas, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to discover. He had always believed that he had seen the worst of human suffering. Abandoned teenagers, struggling single mothers, war veterans with nowhere to go. But a child, alone in the freezing night, that was something he couldn't ignore. It started with whispers. The homeless community spoke of a girl who appeared in the park after dark. No one knew where she came from. Some said she was a lost soul. Others believed she had been abandoned. At first, Daniel thought it was just another urban myth. Las Vegas was full of those. But then the calls started coming in. Night after night, concerned citizens reported seeing a child curled up on a park bench, clutching a thin blanket and a plastic bag. But each time an officer arrived, she was gone. No one had been able to talk to her. No one knew her name. It was as if she vanished into thin air. On one particularly bitter December evening, Daniel decided to check for himself. The forecast predicted record-breaking lows, and even with his thick uniform, he could feel the chill in his bones. The idea of a child sleeping outside in this weather made his stomach turn. He parked his patrol car at the edge of the park and stepped out, his boots crunching against the frosted grass. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the benches and trees. It was eerily silent. Only the distant hum of the city filled the air. And then he saw her, a small figure curled up on a bench, wrapped in a thin, tattered blanket. Her tiny body shivered against the bitter wind. She didn't cry. She didn't move. Daniel's heart pounded. He approached carefully, not wanting to startle her. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said softly, kneeling beside the bench. The girl flinched at his voice, her big, frightened eyes peeking out from beneath the blanket. Up close, she looked even smaller than he had imagined. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and her hands clutched the plastic bag as if it were the most precious thing in the world. She couldn't have been more than 3 years old. "Are you lost?" he asked gently. She didn't answer. He noticed her bare feet peeking out from under the blanket, small, delicate, and blue from the cold. A lump formed in his throat. "My name is Daniel," he continued, keeping his voice warm and calm. "I'm here to help. Are your parents nearby?" Still, no response. She only pulled the blanket tighter around herself, her tiny fingers trembling. Daniel glanced around. The park was empty. There was no sign of anyone watching over her. No parent rushing back in a panic. Nothing. Something was terribly wrong. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Carter. I got a small child, approximately 3 years old, alone in Maple Park. No guardian in sight. Requesting immediate assistance." The radio crackled. "Copy that, Officer Carter. Stay with the child. Backup en route." Daniel turned back to the girl, who was watching him with wide, wary eyes. "Hey, it's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now." She didn't respond. But as the wind howled through the park, she did something that made Daniel's breath catch in his throat. She reached into her plastic bag and pulled out a crumpled photograph. She held it out to him, her tiny fingers trembling. Daniel took it carefully, his heart pounding as he looked at the image. And that was the moment he knew, this wasn't just a lost child. This was something much, much bigger. The photograph that changed everything. Officer Daniel Carter had seen his fair share of strange cases, but as he knelt in front of the shivering little girl on that freezing December night, he knew, deep in his bones, that this one was different. The child, barely 3 years old, had been living alone in Maple Park, surviving the bitter cold with nothing but a thin blanket and a plastic bag filled with who knew what. She hadn't spoken a word. She hadn't cried. And yet, in her tiny, trembling hands, she held something that sent a chill down Daniel's spine, colder than the wind biting at his skin. A photograph. Worn, creased, and barely holding together, the picture showed a woman, young, with kind eyes, her arms wrapped around the very same little girl who now sat in front of him. But it wasn't just the image that unsettled Daniel. It was what was written on the back, in rushed, uneven handwriting. "Please keep her safe. I'll come back for her." Daniel's pulse quickened. This wasn't a case of a child wandering off. Someone had left her here on purpose. Someone who had been desperate. He turned the photo over, studying the woman's face. She looked tired but gentle, her expression filled with a quiet sadness. Was this the girl's mother? Had she abandoned her? Or had something far worse happened? Daniel looked back at the child. She was still watching him. Her big dark eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Not just fear, not just sadness. Something deeper. She hadn't said a word since he found her. And then, just as he was about to ask her something, a soft sound broke the silence between them. Her stomach growled. Daniel's heart ached. She was hungry. How long had she been out here, surviving off scraps? How many nights had she slept on this frozen bench, clutching this photograph like it was the only thing keeping her tied to this world? He removed his jacket without hesitation, wrapping it around her small shoulders. "You're freezing," he murmured, his voice softer now. "Let's get you warm, okay?" She flinched slightly at his touch but didn't pull away. That was a good sign. From a distance, he heard the wail of approaching sirens. Backup was coming, but Daniel had a feeling this wasn't going to be just another routine welfare case. This child had a story, and he was going to find out what it was. The hospital was warm, a stark contrast to the freezing night outside. The little girl sat on the examination table, wrapped in a thick blanket the nurses had given her. She still hadn't spoken, but she was eating. Slowly, cautiously, but eating. Daniel leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching her. The doctors had checked her over. She was malnourished but had no visible injuries, no signs of physical abuse. That was good. But the silence, the way she refused to speak, that was what worried him. He was waiting for Child Protective Services to arrive, but something in his gut told him that handing her over wouldn't be the end of this. A nurse approached, her expression concerned. "She's stable," she said quietly, "but she's been out there for a while. The doctor estimates at least a few weeks." Daniel frowned. "Weeks?" The nurse nodded. "It's a miracle she's still alive." He glanced back at the girl, who was now clutching the photograph again, holding it close to her chest like a lifeline. He exhaled slowly. "She hasn't spoken at all." The nurse shook her head. "Not a word. She understands what we're saying, though. She reacts. But it's like she's too scared to speak." Daniel's jaw tightened. He had seen trauma before. Kids who had been through things no child should ever experience. But this was different. "Has anyone run the photo through the system?" he asked. The nurse hesitated. "They're working on it, but it's old and there's no name on it. It might take time." Daniel nodded, his mind already racing. There had to be a reason she had been left in that park, a reason why her mother, or whoever that woman was, hadn't come back. And until he found out, he wasn't going anywhere. As he turned back to the little girl, she suddenly did something that made his breath catch. For the first time since he found her, she reached out, tentatively, hesitantly, her small fingers brushing against his sleeve. A silent plea. Daniel crouched down beside her, his voice soft. "It's okay," he murmured. "You don't have to be scared anymore." She looked up at him then, her dark eyes filled with something that nearly broke him. And in the faintest whisper, so soft he almost didn't hear it, she spoke. One word. A name. Lily. Daniel's heart clenched. Her name. Her first word. And somehow, he knew, this was only the beginning. The secrets buried in silence. The sound of rain pattered softly against the hospital window, a rhythmic lull that might have been calming under different circumstances. But inside the dimly lit room, Officer Daniel Carter felt anything but calm. He sat motionless in the chair beside the hospital bed, his eyes locked onto the little girl curled up beneath the thick blankets. She was asleep now, her small body rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. The weight of exhaustion had finally pulled her under. But that single word she had whispered before drifting off still echoed in his mind. Lily. It wasn't just a name. It was a key, a fragile clue to a mystery that felt bigger than he had anticipated. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together as he tried to piece everything together. A toddler, alone in a park for weeks. No missing persons report matching her description. A single photograph of a woman who might be her mother, with a desperate message scrawled on the back. Please keep her safe. I'll come back for her. But no one had come. And the more Daniel thought about it, the more a sick feeling curled in his gut. What if no one ever would? Outside the room, the hospital hallways were quiet, save for the occasional beeping of machines and the muffled voices of nurses making their rounds. Daniel stepped out, rubbing his tired eyes as he made his way toward the nurses' station. A woman in a navy blue coat was already waiting there, flipping through a thin folder of papers. She had sharp brown eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Emily Graves, from Child Protective Services. She looked up the second she saw him. Officer Carter. Daniel nodded, stepping forward. She shut the folder. I've read the preliminary reports. No records of a missing child matching her description. No identification, no fingerprints on file, and no reports of a woman matching the one in the photograph. It's like they don't exist. Daniel's jaw tightened. That's impossible. Emily let out a slow breath. You'd think so. But it happens. Children fall through the cracks. Parents keep them off the grid for whatever reason. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's something worse. Daniel hated the implication. You think she was running from someone. Emily didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled out a plastic evidence bag from her folder, the one containing the photograph. She turned it over, pointing at the rushed handwriting. She was desperate. You don't write something like this unless you believe there's no other choice. Daniel ran a hand down his face. Who was she running from? Emily studied him for a moment. You've already grown attached, haven't you? Daniel didn't bother denying it. He looked back toward the room where Lily was sleeping. She hasn't spoken except to tell me her name. But when I found her, she wasn't crying. She wasn't asking for help. It's like she's been trained to stay silent. Emily exhaled sharply. That's a learned behavior. Kids don't just go mute for no reason. Either she's been through something traumatic, or someone taught her that staying quiet is the only way to stay safe. A heavy silence settled between them. Daniel's mind raced with possibilities, but none of them were good. He looked back at Emily. So what happens now? She sighed. She'll be placed in temporary care while we investigate. If no family steps forward, she'll enter the system. Daniel knew how that worked. Kids like Lily, kids with no past, no records, often got lost in a bureaucratic shuffle. She'd be sent to a foster home, maybe bounced between a few, and something in him rebelled at the thought. Not her. Not after everything she'd been through. Back inside the room, Lily was still asleep, but her small fingers had tightened around the photograph. Daniel sat down again, watching her. He should have felt relief that she was safe now, that she was no longer alone in the cold. But something gnawed at him, an instinct, deep in his gut, telling him that this wasn't over. And then, as if the universe itself was confirming his worst fears, his phone buzzed. A text from dispatch. Urgent. Need you back at the station. You're going to want to see this. Daniel's stomach dropped. Carefully, he stood, casting one last glance at the sleeping child before stepping out of the room. He didn't know what he was about to walk into, But he had a terrible feeling that whatever it was, it would change everything. The truth in the shadows. Daniel Carter had seen a lot in his years as an officer, cases that kept him awake at night, stories that left scars deeper than any wound. But as he walked into the station that evening, something about this one felt different. His gut told him the worst was still ahead. The chief barely looked up when Daniel entered. He just gestured toward the large screen on the wall, where a grainy security video was paused. "Watch." Daniel crossed the room, eyes narrowing at the frozen image, a dimly lit gas station. The timestamp was from 3 nights ago, the night he had found Lily. The video started playing. A woman appeared, her face partially hidden by a hood. She carried Lily in her arms, moving fast, glancing over her shoulder as if someone was chasing her. She pressed the little girl into the arms of a stunned store clerk, whispering something. Then she ran. And just seconds later, a dark SUV skidded into the parking lot. 2 men jumped out. Not cops, not ordinary civilians. The way they moved was practiced, efficient. They weren't looking for a lost woman. They were hunting her. One of them found something on the ground, a wallet she must have dropped in her rush. He flipped through it, marked something to his partner, and they bolted back to the SUV. The video cut off. Daniel clenched his fists. Did we track the plate? The chief shook his head. Stolen vehicle. No ID on the men. No trace of the woman. But that. He pointed at Lily in the video. That tells us one thing for sure. Daniel finished the sentence for him. She wasn't abandoning her. She was saving her. The chief nodded. Daniel's stomach twisted. If those men were after Lily's mother, they were probably looking for Lily too. And he had just put her in the system, where anyone with the right connections could find her. His phone buzzed. A call from an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Carter. A single, ragged breath on the other end. Then a woman's voice. Hoarse, urgent. You have her, don't you? Daniel's pulse jumped. Who is this? The woman inhaled sharply. I don't have time. They're coming. They know where she is. The line went dead. For a second, Daniel just stood there, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles went white. Then he bolted for the door. The hospital was too quiet when he got there. Too still. Daniel moved fast, his heart hammering as he turned the last corner. The door to Lily's room was open. The bed, empty. The nurse who had been watching her was slumped against the wall, dazed. They said they were with child services, she stammered. Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest. He turned and ran. It took him less than 10 minutes to find them. A black SUV, just like the one from the video, was pulling out of the hospital parking lot. Through the tinted window, he caught a glimpse. Lily, pressed against the door, wide-eyed and terrified. Daniel didn't think. He acted. Gun drawn, he slammed his car into gear, cutting the SUV off before it could escape. The driver swerved, tires screeching. A man in a suit jumped out, his hand reaching for something inside his coat. Daniel fired a warning shot. Step away from the child. For a second, there was only silence. Then, the passenger door burst open, and Lily jumped. Daniel barely had time to react before she crashed into him, arms locking around his neck in a desperate grip. She wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. But when she buried her face into his shoulder, he felt something warm and damp against his skin. Silent tears. The men hesitated, just long enough for the sound of sirens to fill the air. They fled, and Daniel didn't chase them, because he already had what they wanted. And there was no way in hell he was letting them take her. 3 days later, the woman from the video showed up. She was thinner, weaker, bruises lining her arms. But when she saw Lily safe in Daniel's care, something inside her broke. She dropped to her knees, sobbing. Lily didn't hesitate. She ran into her mother's arms. For the first time since he had found her, Daniel heard her voice, soft, but certain. Mama. And in that moment, he knew. He hadn't just saved her. She had saved him too. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.